Hey there. How's it going? Thanks for joining me today. Whether you're relaxing at home, on your commute, or winding down for the evening, I'm really glad you're here. Picture this. It's 4:30 in the morning on March 21st, 1918. The Western Front has been locked in bloody stalemate for nearly 4 years. Millions of men crouch in trenches stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland, separated by a hellscape of barbed wire and shell craters that hasn't moved more than a few miles in either direction since 1914. The war that was supposed to end by Christmas of that first year has ground on and on, consuming entire generations. But in the pre-dawn darkness of this spring morning, something unprecedented is about to happen. Along a 50-mile stretch of front line, German artillery crews make final adjustments to over 6,000 guns. They've been preparing for this moment for months, stockpiling shells, moving equipment under cover of night, calculating trajectories with mathematical precision that would impress modern computers. The Germans call it Operation Michael. The British will remember it as the day they nearly lost the war. At exactly 4:40 in the morning, the largest artillery bombardment in human history begins. Here's what's actually happening in those first 5 hours. 1,600,000 shells rain down on British positions. That's over 3,000 shells every minute for 300 straight minutes. The mathematical reality is staggering. Imagine a shell exploding somewhere along that 50-mile front every 2 seconds, without pause, from before dawn until nearly 10 in the morning. The sound is audible in London, 150 miles away. Seismographs in Switzerland register the impacts as earthquakes. But this isn't just raw destruction. The Germans have revolutionized artillery science. Instead of the week-long bombardments that previous offensives relied on those massive, predictable barrages that telegraphed exactly where attacks would come, Operation Michael uses precise, calculated fire. They target command posts with surgical accuracy. They hit supply depots. They sever communication lines. Most importantly, they use a new type of shell filled with phosgene gas that penetrates British gas masks and forces defenders to abandon their positions. When the barrage finally stops at 9:40 that morning, something emerges from the German trenches that British soldiers have never seen before. These aren't the waves of infantry charging across no man's land that had characterized previous attacks. These are stormtroopers, CR, specially trained assault units equipped with light machine guns, flamethrowers, and grenades, moving in small groups with tactics so advanced they won't be widely adopted by other armies until World War II. The stormtroopers don't attack the strongest British positions. Instead, they flow around them like water, finding weak points, exploiting gaps, moving forward while leaving isolated strongholds for follow-up forces to deal with. Within hours, they've penetrated deeper into British lines than anyone has advanced on the Western Front since the war began. By the end of the first day, German forces have moved 8 miles, a distance that previous offensives had failed to achieve in months of fighting. The British Fifth Army begins to collapse. Here's the truly mind-bending part. For 72 hours, the outcome of the entire war hangs in the balance. Not metaphorically, but mathematically. German forces advance 40 miles in the first week of Operation Michael, ASO, the furthest movement on the Western Front in 4 years. They capture over 1,000 square miles of territory and take 60,000 British prisoners. More importantly, they come within artillery range of Amiens, the crucial railway junction that connects British and French forces. If Amiens falls, the Allied armies will be split in two. The British commander, Field Marshal Douglas Haig, sends a message to his troops that reveals just how close Germany comes to total victory. It's called the Backs to the Wall Order, and when you read it today, you can feel the desperation. Every position must be held to the last man. There must be no retirement. With our backs to the wall and believing in the justice of our cause, each one of us must fight on to the end. This isn't military rhetoric. This is a man who believes his army faces annihilation. In Paris, the government begins evacuating. For the second time in living memory, German forces threaten the French capital. The difference is that in 1870, during the Franco-Prussian War, the Germans had to siege Paris for months. Now they're approaching with the firepower and tactics to take it by storm. French civilians pack their belongings and flee south. The Louvre begins crating its masterpieces for shipment to safety. But here's where the story gets really fascinating and tragic. Operation Michael succeeds too well for its own good. The German advance moves so fast that their supply lines can't keep up. Remember, this is 1918. There are no trucks carrying supplies, no radio communication coordinating the advance. Everything depends on horses, wagons, and telegraph lines that advance forces have left far behind. The stormtroopers who achieve the breakthrough are carrying 3 days' worth of food and ammunition. When they capture British supply depots, they discover something that hasn't been available in Germany for years: white bread, chocolate, canned meat, tobacco. Many German soldiers, who've been surviving on turnip soup and black bread for months, stop to eat. Some get drunk on captured alcohol. The momentum that comes from surprise and careful planning begins to dissipate as human nature takes over. Meanwhile, something unprecedented happens on the Allied side. For the first time in the war, British and French commanders agree to unified command under French General Ferdinand Foch. More critically, American forces that have been training in England for months are rushed to the front. Fresh troops who haven't been ground down by 4 years of trench warfare throw themselves into the gap that German forces have created. By April 5th, Operation Michael grinds to a halt just 12 miles from Amiens. The Germans have achieved the greatest tactical success of the war, but they lack the resources to exploit it. Within weeks, American divisions are arriving in France at the rate of 10,000 men per day. The mathematical balance that favored Germany for those crucial 72 hours shifts irreversibly toward the Allies. But that's just one moment when Germany nearly rewrote history. Let's step back and look at the other times when different decisions could have created an entirely different world. The story really begins in 1914 with something called the Schlieffen Plan. This was Germany's master strategy for fighting a two-front war against France and Russia simultaneously. The plan was brilliant in its audacity. Knock France out of the war in 6 weeks by attacking through Belgium, then turn east to deal with the slower mobilizing Russian army. Alfred von Schlieffen, the German general who devised it, spent years calculating train schedules, march rates, and supply requirements down to the day. Here's what makes the Schlieffen Plan so terrifying. It almost worked. In the first 6 weeks of the war, German armies advance exactly as Schlieffen predicted. They sweep through Belgium, defeat French forces at the Battle of the Frontiers, and drive toward Paris with mechanical precision. By early September, German cavalry patrols are within 25 miles of the Eiffel Tower. The French government flees to Bordeaux. It looks like the 6-week timeline might actually hold. Then comes the Battle of the Marne, and here's where we see how incredibly thin the margins of history really are. The German advance stalls just 30 miles from Paris, not because of superior Allied strategy, but because of a gap that opens between two German armies. French reconnaissance pilots spot this gap from the air and report it to headquarters. General Joseph Joffre, the French commander, realizes this might be his only chance to counterattack. What happens next seems almost comical in hindsight, but it saves Western civilization as we know it. The French rush reserves to exploit the gap, but they don't have enough trucks or trains to move them quickly enough. So they commandeer every taxi in Paris, TI, over 600 vehicles, and send them racing toward the front loaded with soldiers. The taxis of the Marne become legend, but they represent something more profound: the moment when industrial civilization itself mobilizes to prevent German victory. The counterattack succeeds, but barely. German forces withdraw to positions along the Aisne River and begin digging trenches. The war that was supposed to end in 6 weeks settles into 4 years of stalemate. But here's the crucial point. If the Schlieffen Plan had succeeded, if those 30 miles had been covered, if that gap hadn't opened, if the taxis hadn't been available, 1904, France falls in September 1914, and everything that follows changes completely. Even after the Schlieffen Plan fails, Germany comes close to victory through other means. The U-boat campaign of 1917 brings Britain to the edge of starvation. German submarines sink 1 ship out of every 4 bound for British ports. Food rationing becomes so severe that riots break out in London. The British government estimates they have just 6 weeks of food reserves remaining when America finally enters the war in April 1917. Here's what's really happening during the submarine campaign. Germany is conducting the first systematic attempt at economic warfare through technology. Their U-boats aren't just sinking military vessels, they're targeting the merchant ships that keep British civilization functioning. Wheat from Argentina, beef from Australia, oil from America, all of it has to cross the Atlantic in ships that German submarines can sink faster than British shipyards can replace them. The mathematics are brutal and simple. In April 1917 alone, German U-boats sink 850,000 tons of Allied shipping. British shipyards can build about 200,000 tons of new ships per month. The gap is unsustainable. Britain is literally being starved into submission. The crisis becomes so severe that the British Admiralty finally adopts the convoy system, organizing merchant ships into groups protected by naval escorts. It's a strategy that had been proposed earlier but rejected because it seemed to reduce shipping efficiency. In reality, it saves the war for the Allies. Convoy losses drop to less than 1%, while independent ships continue to be sunk at catastrophic rates. But even the convoy system barely works. U-boat technology is advancing rapidly. By 1918, German submarines carry enough fuel to operate off the American coast. They sink ships within sight of New York Harbor. If the war had continued another year, if Germany had built U-boats faster, if American shipbuilding hadn't reached industrial levels that surpassed even German sinking rates, the outcome could have been very different. There's another technological factor that people often overlook: the Paris gun. This is a German artillery piece so massive it has to be mounted on railway cars. It fires shells that travel 75 miles through the upper atmosphere to land in Paris. When Parisians first hear the explosions, they assume they're being bombed by aircraft flying too high to see. The reality is even more terrifying. They're being shelled from beyond the horizon by a weapon that represents the Phili Taifas, future of warfare. The Paris gun doesn't cause massive casualties, but it demonstrates something profound about German technological capabilities. They're developing weapons systems that won't be matched by other nations for decades. If the war had continued, if German scientists had more time, if resources hadn't been diverted to desperate infantry offensives, what other technological surprises might have emerged? Consider poison gas, which Germany introduces at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915. The first chlorine gas attack creates a 4-mile gap in Allied lines and could have led to breakthrough if German commanders had been prepared to exploit it. They literally didn't believe their own weapon would work so well. Follow-up attacks use phosgene, which is deadlier, and mustard gas, which persists for weeks and makes entire areas uninhabitable. Chemical warfare represents something new in human conflict, AIS, the ability to make territory itself toxic. German gas attacks kill 90,000 Allied soldiers and wound over 1 million more. More importantly, they force every soldier on the Western Front to fight while wearing equipment that reduces visibility, restricts breathing, and creates constant psychological stress. Gas doesn't just kill, it transforms the entire nature of combat. But perhaps the most overlooked factor in Germany's near victory is the collapse of Russia. The February Revolution that overthrows Tsar Nicholas happens in part because of military disasters against Germany. The October Revolution that brings Lenin to power is funded partly by German gold, money that flows through Switzerland to support Bolshevik activities. When the Bolsheviks sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918, they free up over 1 million German soldiers for transfer to the Western Front. Here's what this means in practical terms. Operation Michael is possible only because Russia exits the war. Those stormtroopers who break through British lines in March 1918 include veterans of campaigns in East Prussia, Poland, and Ukraine. The artillery barrage that creates the breakthrough uses guns and ammunition that had been fighting Russians 6 months earlier. Without the Russian collapse, without Bolshevik victory, without German gold-funding revolution, the Western Front remains locked in stalemate. The interconnections become mind-bending when you trace them fully. German U-boats sink ships carrying supplies to Russia, weakening the Tsarist government. German agents fund Bolsheviks who promise to end Russian participation in the war. German military success in the east triggers Russian Revolution. Russian Revolution frees German resources for offensives in the west. Each factor amplifies the others in ways that bring Germany tantalizingly close to total victory. When we look at these near misses together, the 30 miles at the Marne, the 6 weeks of food reserves in Britain, the 72 hours when Amiens nearly fell, we start to understand something profound about the fragility of the world we inherited. The outcome that seems inevitable in hindsight was actually determined by margins so narrow they barely qualify as margins at all. Every assumption we make about the 20th century rests on foundations that nearly crumbled in those crucial moments. Democracy's triumph wasn't destined. American global leadership wasn't predetermined. The colonial empires that dissolved after 1945 might have lasted centuries under different circumstances. The very concept of national self-determination that shaped the modern world emerged from Allied victory that hung by threads. In our next chapter, we'll explore what that different world would have looked like, the maps that would have been drawn, the borders that would have emerged, the empires that would have endured, because understanding how close Germany came to victory is just the beginning. The really fascinating question is what they would have done with that victory once they achieved it. The world that almost was beckons from across the narrow divide of historical accident. It's time to cross over and see what we would have inherited if those 72 hours in March 1918 had ended differently. November 11th, 1919. Not in a railway car in the forest of Compiègne, where German delegates signed the armistice that ended the war in our timeline, but in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, the same room where Otto von Bismarck proclaimed the German Empire in 1871, now witnesses an even more momentous occasion. Kaiser Wilhelm II, resplendent in his military uniform, dictates terms to representatives of the defeated Allied powers. The irony is deliberate and devastating. Where the Treaty of Versailles in our world humiliated Germany and planted the seeds of future conflict, this alternate Treaty of Versailles creates a German-dominated order that will reshape every continent. The maps being redrawn in this gilded hall will govern the lives of billions for generations to come. But let's start with what happens to the immediate losers, because their fate reveals the scope of German ambitions. France, the proud republic that had resisted German invasion twice in living memory, faces partition. Here's what the German negotiators demand, and here's why each demand makes strategic sense from their perspective. Alsace-Lorraine, of course, remains German, too. That was never in question after German victory. But now Germany claims much more. Normandy, with its crucial ports on the English Channel, becomes a German territory under direct imperial administration. Brittany, that Celtic peninsula that had maintained its distinct culture under French rule, becomes an autonomous German protectorate. Why these specific territories? Look at a map and the logic becomes clear. Normandy gives Germany control over the approaches to Britain. Any future British attempt to challenge German hegemony will face German submarines, aircraft, and artillery based just miles from Dover. Brittany provides deep-water ports facing the Atlantic, perfect for projecting German naval power toward America. The message to both Britain and the United States is unmistakable. German power now extends to every ocean. What remains of France operates under a government that exists entirely at German pleasure. The Third Republic is dissolved. In its place emerges something unprecedented, a French puppet state that maintains the appearance of sovereignty while operating under German oversight. French foreign policy requires German approval. French military forces are limited to internal security. Most crucially, French industrial production is coordinated with German needs through what they call economic cooperation agreements. Here's what this really means in practical terms. French steel mills produce materials for German factories. French farmers grow food for German cities. French workers migrate to German industrial centers where labor shortages have emerged after 4 years of war. France doesn't disappear from the map, but it becomes something fundamentally different, a resource base for German expansion rather than an independent nation pursuing its own interests. The transformation goes deeper than politics or economics. French culture itself begins to shift under German influence. German becomes a required subject in French schools, taught alongside French literature and history. But this isn't the brutal cultural suppression that characterized Nazi occupation in our timeline. Instead, German administrators promote what they call cultural synthesis. The the idea that French and German civilizations can merge into something greater than either achieved alone. The results are fascinating and disturbing in equal measure. French architects begin incorporating German design principles into their buildings. French composers experiment with German musical forms. French philosophers engage with German intellectual traditions in ways that produce entirely new schools of thought. Whether this represents cultural enrichment or cultural destruction depends entirely on your perspective, but there's no question it creates something unprecedented in European history. Britain faces a different kind of humiliation, TMCI, one that strikes at the heart of what made Britain great. The Royal Navy, which had ruled the seas for centuries, must reduce its fleet to levels that ensure German maritime supremacy. Here's the mathematical reality. Britain can maintain 12 battleships, while Germany builds 24. British naval bases in the Mediterranean must close, while German vessels gain access to Egyptian ports. Most devastating of all, British naval construction must be approved by German naval architects to ensure it doesn't threaten the new balance of power. But the real blow to British power comes through economic warfare disguised as commercial cooperation. German banks gain significant influence over British financial institutions. German companies acquire stakes in British industries. German merchants gain preferential access to British colonial markets. The City of London, that financial centre that had funded global trade for generations, finds itself operating under constraints designed to benefit German economic interests. The British Empire begins its death spiral decades ahead of schedule, but not through the gradual decolonization we know from our timeline. Instead, it fragments under German pressure, applied at carefully chosen pressure points. German East Africa expands to absorb British territories in Kenya and Uganda. German Southwest Africa gains access to South African ports. Most significantly, German naval bases appear in India, justified as necessary for maintaining order in the Indian Ocean. India itself becomes the crucial test case for how the New World Order will function. The independence movement that had been gaining strength before the war faces a completely different situation. Instead of negotiating with a weakening Britain, Indian leaders must navigate between British colonial administrators and German advisors who arrive to help manage what Germans call imperial coordination. Here's where the psychology of empire becomes crucial. German officials don't see themselves as conquering the British Empire. They're modernizing it. They introduce German administrative methods that emphasize efficiency and technical competence. They build railways and telegraphs that connect Indian markets to German industrial centers. They establish schools that teach both English and German, creating an educated class capable of managing what they envision as a German-British condominium over the subcontinent. The Indian independence movement splits over how to respond. Some leaders see German influence as an opportunity to play imperial powers against each other. Others worry that German efficiency will make foreign domination more permanent than British bumbling ever could. The result is a three-way struggle for India's future that produces outcomes none of the participants anticipated. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, German victory creates an entirely different map than the one we inherited from our timeline. Here's where German planners reveal the true scope of their imperial vision, because what they create in the East isn't just territorial expansion, laboratory for new forms of political organization. The Russian Empire, already convulsed by revolution, faces partition on a scale that defies comprehension. Ukraine becomes a German client state under a restored monarchy. Tatiate, the hetmanate that had briefly existed in the 17th century, is revived as a buffer between Germany and whatever emerges from Russian chaos. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania become German duchies ruled by German nobles but populated by Baltic peoples who retain their local customs and languages. Poland, that nation which had disappeared from European maps in the 18th century, reappears but in a form no Polish patriot had imagined. The new Polish kingdom includes ethnic Polish territories from all three former partitioning powers, creating a Poland larger than any that had existed since the 17th century. But this Poland exists as a German satellite, with a German prince on the throne and German advisors managing its foreign policy. Here's what makes this Eastern settlement so innovative. Instead of simply annexing territories and imposing German rule, The Germans create a network of formerly independent states bound to Germany through dynasty, economics, and military alliance. It's a system that won't be attempted again until the Soviet Union creates its satellite states after our World War II. But the German version operates through monarchical legitimacy rather than ideological conformity. The psychological impact is profound. Polish, Lithuanian, and Ukrainian nationalisms don't disappear, but they develop within a German-dominated framework. These peoples achieve something approaching statehood, but only as components of a larger German system. The result is a form of nationalism that's simultaneously authentic and constrained, real enough to command loyalty, but limited enough to ensure German hegemony. In the Caucasus, German influence creates outcomes that seem almost impossible from our perspective. The oil fields of Baku, those energy resources that will prove crucial to 20th century development, fall under German control through agreements with local leaders who prefer German promises to Russian threats. But instead of direct occupation, Germans establish something like a protectorate that respects local religious and cultural traditions while ensuring oil flows toward German industrial centers. The Ottoman Empire, Germany's crucial ally, not only survives but expands under German protection. Here's where alternate history becomes truly mind-bending, because Ottoman survival changes everything about the modern Middle East. There is no Turkish Republic under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, because there's no need for the radical transformation that creates modern Turkey. Instead, the Ottoman Empire modernizes gradually under German tutelage, maintaining its Islamic character while adopting German administrative and military methods. What this means for the Middle East is revolutionary. There are no British and French mandates carving up Ottoman territories because the Ottomans retain control under German guarantee. Palestine remains an Ottoman province where Jewish immigration continues, but within Ottoman legal frameworks rather than British promises. Syria and Iraq remain Ottoman provinces that modernize without fragmenting. The entire system of Middle Eastern nation-states that emerged from Ottoman collapse simply doesn't exist. Instead, what emerges is something unprecedented, a modernizing Islamic empire that maintains traditional legitimacy while adopting industrial technology. German engineers build railways connecting Istanbul to Baghdad and beyond. German military advisors help create Ottoman armed forces equipped with German weapons and trained in German tactics. German merchants establish trading networks that make Constantinople a rival to London and New York. The cultural implications are staggering. Islamic civilization, instead of fragmenting under European pressure, adapts and strengthens under German partnership. Ottoman universities begin teaching German engineering and scientific methods, alongside traditional Islamic scholarship. Ottoman artists experiment with German aesthetic principles while maintaining Islamic themes. Ottoman writers engage with German philosophical traditions while expressing Islamic values. But perhaps the most profound transformation occurs across the Atlantic, where American defeat creates psychological and political changes that reshape the New World as dramatically as German victory reshapes the Old. The United States that emerges from this alternate war is a wounded giant, humiliated by its failure to decisively influence European events and facing a hostile German presence on both sides of the Atlantic. American entry into the war, remember, came too late to prevent German victory. American soldiers arrived in France just in time to witness Allied collapse rather than participate in Allied victory. The psychological impact on American national consciousness is devastating. Instead of emerging as a global superpower, America retreats into bitter isolation. The Monroe Doctrine, that 19th century declaration of American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, becomes a desperate defensive measure rather than a confident assertion of regional dominance. German naval bases in Normandy and Brittany make American Atlantic shores vulnerable for the first time since the War of 1812. German submarines operating from Ottoman ports threaten American shipping in the Mediterranean. The economic consequences follow inevitably. American industries that had geared up to supply Allied forces find themselves with massive overcapacity and no markets. American agriculture that had expanded to feed European armies faces collapsing demand. American banks that had loaned money to Allied governments watch their investments disappear with Allied defeat. The boom economy that characterized American participation in our World War I never materializes because American participation proves ineffective. Instead of the Roaring Twenties, America experiences what historians in this timeline call the Bitter Twenties, a decade of economic stagnation, political isolation, and cultural introspection. Jazz still emerges from African American communities, but it develops in an atmosphere of national pessimism rather than exuberant optimism. Hollywood still creates the motion picture industry, but American films compete with German productions that celebrate very different values. Most significantly, American politics shifts in directions that seem almost impossible from our perspective. The Democratic Party, associated with Woodrow Wilson's failed intervention, faces electoral devastation. The Republican Party splits between traditional conservatives who want to rebuild American strength and radical isolationists who blame international engagement for national humiliation. New political movements emerge that combine American populism with ideas borrowed from European socialism and German nationalism. The psychological transformation goes deeper than politics. Americans who had believed in their national destiny to lead the world must confront evidence that their country isn't exceptional. It's just another great power that can be defeated like any other. The optimism that characterized American culture since the Civil War gives way to something darker and more complex. American literature explores themes of loss and limitation rather than expansion and opportunity. American philosophy grapples with questions about national purpose that previous generations never had to consider. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japanese leaders watch German victory with fascination and alarm. Japan had been building its own empire in East Asia, but always with the assumption that Western powers would eventually limit Japanese expansion. German victory over those Western powers changes the calculation completely. If European colonial empires are fragmenting under German pressure, why shouldn't Japan expand its own sphere of influence? The result is Japanese expansion into China that occurs decades ahead of schedule and with much less Western resistance. Japanese forces occupy Manchuria not in 1931, as happened in our timeline, but in 1921, when European powers are too focused on accommodating Germany to worry about Asian developments. Japanese influence spreads into southeastern China, creating a Japanese sphere that encompasses some of the world's most important industrial and agricultural regions. But Japanese expansion occurs within a very different international context. Instead of facing united Western opposition, Japan finds itself navigating between German and American spheres of influence. German advisors help Japanese industries adopt German manufacturing methods. German diplomatic support helps legitimize Japanese expansion in Asia. The result is a Japanese empire that grows faster and larger than in our timeline, but always within constraints imposed by the new German-dominated world order. Here's where the global transformation becomes truly comprehensive. In Africa, German colonial expansion creates a belt of German territories stretching from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. German East Africa absorbs British territories. German Southwest Africa gains access to South African resources, and new German colonies emerge in territories that France and Britain can no longer defend. But this isn't simply European conquest of African peoples. It's the emergence of German colonial methods that emphasize economic development over pure extraction. German colonial administrators, influenced by their experience managing diverse populations within Europe, experiment with forms of indirect rule that preserve African political structures while directing African economic development toward German needs. The results are complex and contradictory. African societies that modernize rapidly but within frameworks designed to serve German interests. African cities that grow and prosper, but as components of German economic networks rather than centers of African political power. Even in South America, German influence spreads through economic penetration rather than direct political control. Railways. German companies invest in South American mining operations. German immigrants establish communities that maintain German culture while adapting to South American conditions. The result is a South America that remains politically independent but becomes economically integrated into German-dominated global networks. When we step back and look at this alternate world map as a whole, what emerges is something unprecedented in human history, a truly global empire that operates through multiple forms of control rather than uniform direct rule. German territories under direct administration exist alongside German protectorates, German client states, German economic zones, and German spheres of influence. The result is a world system that's simultaneously more integrated and more diverse than anything that had existed before. But maps and political arrangements tell only part of the story. To understand what it really means to live in this German-dominated world, we need to explore how ordinary people experience the cultural, economic, and social changes that flow from German victory. We need to understand what it feels like when the language of international commerce shifts from English to German, when the center of global culture moves from London and Paris to Berlin and Vienna, when the assumptions that govern daily life transform in ways both subtle and profound. That's the world we'll explore in our next chapter. Not the world of Kaisers and generals, but the world of workers and artists, teachers and merchants, the millions of ordinary people whose lives unfold within the new reality that German victory creates. Your alarm clock rings at 7 in the morning in London, or rather, in what's still called London but feels increasingly German with each passing year. As you reach over to turn off the clock, you notice it's a Junghans timepiece, manufactured in the Black Forest and accurate to within seconds per month. German engineering has become synonymous with reliability, and British manufacturers simply can't compete with products that combine Germanic precision with economies of scale that stretch across a continent. You turn on the radio, and the morning news comes in English, but with a distinctly different accent than your grandparents would recognize. The BBC now employs German-trained announcers whose pronunciation reflects the cosmopolitan standard emerging across the German-dominated world. After the local weather and traffic reports, you hear updates from Berlin, Vienna, and Constantinople, the cities that now matter most in global affairs. New York and Paris still get mentioned, but as regional centers rather than world capitals. This is daily life in the German century, and it's both more subtle and more profound than simple political domination might suggest. In the kitchen, you prepare breakfast using ingredients that tell the story of how thoroughly the world economy has been restructured. Your coffee comes from German East Africa, where plantation agriculture has expanded under scientific management that increases yields while reducing labor costs. Your sugar comes from German territories in the Pacific, where modern processing methods create products that are both cheaper and purer than traditional alternatives. Even your morning newspaper is printed on paper manufactured in German mills using wood from German-controlled forests in Eastern Europe. But here's what makes this transformation so psychologically complex. You're not living under obvious oppression. Britain remains Britain, with its parliament and its traditions and its sense of national identity intact. What's changed is more subtle, the gradual shift of economic power, cultural influence, and global importance toward German centers of authority. You're free to criticize this arrangement, and many people do, but criticism feels increasingly irrelevant when the practical benefits of German efficiency are visible in every aspect of daily life. Your children walk to school carrying textbooks that reflect this new reality. English literature and history remain central to their education, but German language instruction begins in primary school, not as foreign language study, but as practical preparation for adult life. The most prestigious universities require German proficiency for admission. The best job opportunities require the ability to communicate with German business partners. Learning German isn't imposed by political decree, ARPASO, it's incentivized by economic opportunity. Here's what's really happening in those classrooms. British children are learning about their own history and culture, but they're also learning about German achievements in science, technology, and administration. They study the Holy Roman Empire alongside the British Empire. They read Goethe and Schiller alongside Shakespeare and Dickens. They learn about German philosophical traditions that emphasize systematic thinking and scientific method. The result isn't the replacement of British culture, but its modification through exposure to German intellectual traditions. The changes go deeper than formal education. Popular entertainment reflects the new cultural balance that's emerging across the German-dominated world. British music halls still feature traditional performers, but they also showcase German operetta and Austrian waltz music that audiences find increasingly appealing. British publishers still produce novels and poetry, But they also translate German works that explore themes and use techniques unavailable in traditional English literature. Cinema provides the clearest example of how cultural influence operates in this new world. British film studios still exist, but they struggle to compete with German productions that combine sophisticated storytelling with technical innovations that British studios can't match. German films aren't propaganda in any obvious sense. They're simply better entertainment, produced with resources and expertise that German cultural industries have developed through government support and international distribution networks. But the real transformation occurs in Babelsberg, just outside Berlin, where the German film industry has established what people are starting to call the European Hollywood. Here's where actors like Marlene Dietrich and Emil Jannings create performances that define global standards for cinematic excellence. Here's where directors like Fritz Lang and F.W. Murnau experiment with techniques that push the boundaries of what motion pictures can achieve. Here's where producers with access to German capital and German markets create films that reach audiences from Lisbon to Constantinople to Cairo. The psychological impact on global culture is profound. Instead of American stories about individual success and democratic values, the world watches German stories that emphasize collective achievement and social responsibility. Instead of American heroes who triumph through personal courage and natural virtue, global audiences see German heroes who succeed through education, discipline, and systematic effort. The very definition of what makes a story worth telling shifts toward German cultural preferences. Music undergoes a similar transformation, but in ways that create something entirely new rather than simply replacing one tradition with another. Jazz still emerges from African American communities in the United States, but it develops within a very different cultural context. Instead of spreading through American commercial networks, jazz spreads through German cultural channels that modify it according to German aesthetic principles. The result is a form of jazz that emphasizes complex harmonies and structured improvisation rather than the free-form expression that characterizes American jazz in our timeline. Meanwhile, classical music experiences a renaissance as German patronage supports composers and performers who might otherwise struggle to find audiences. The Vienna Philharmonic becomes the world's most prestigious orchestra, not just because of Austrian musical traditions, but because of German financial support and German cultural promotion. Concert halls in German territories showcase musical innovations that influence global standards for serious music. But perhaps the most significant cultural shift occurs in the realm of ideas, the basic assumptions about how society should be organized and what values should guide human behavior. German intellectual traditions emphasize systematic thinking, scientific method, and social responsibility in ways that gradually influence how people throughout the German-dominated world approach fundamental questions about politics, economics, and ethics. Here's what this means in practical terms. In schools across the German sphere of influence, children learn about social organization as a scientific problem that can be solved through careful observation, systematic analysis, and rational implementation of effective solutions. They study economic systems as engineering challenges that require technical expertise rather than ideological commitment. They approach political questions as administrative problems that can be resolved through competent management rather than popular passion. The results are visible in everything from urban planning to industrial organization. German-influenced cities develop according to comprehensive plans that coordinate transportation, housing, commerce, and recreation more effectively than the haphazard growth that characterizes cities in other regions. German-influenced industries adopt management methods that increase productivity while reducing workplace conflict through systematic attention to worker needs and concerns. Even agriculture undergoes transformation as German scientific methods spread throughout the German economic sphere. Farmers learn techniques for soil management, crop rotation, and livestock breeding that increase yields while maintaining long-term sustainability. Agricultural education emphasizes scientific principles rather than traditional practices, creating farming communities that think systematically about their relationship to natural environment and global markets. The technological development that flows from German dominance creates changes that affect everyone's daily experience. German research universities, supported by imperial resources and connected to global networks of scholars, achieve breakthroughs that might not occur for decades in our timeline. Synthetic fuel production, advanced metallurgy, precision manufacturing, electronic communication, AAD. All of these technologies advance more rapidly when German scientists have access to worldwide resources and worldwide markets for their innovations. Here's where the mathematics of empire become crucial. German research institutions can draw on intellectual resources from across Europe, Asia, and Africa. German industries can test innovations in markets that span multiple continents. German investors can fund development projects that might seem too expensive or too risky for smaller economic systems. The result is technological progress that accelerates beyond what any single nation could achieve in isolation. But technology isn't neutral. It reflects the values and priorities of the people who develop it. German technological advancement emphasizes efficiency, reliability, and systematic improvement rather than revolutionary innovation or individual creativity. German-designed automobiles prioritize durability and engineering excellence over style or marketing appeal. German-designed aircraft emphasize safety and performance over speed or glamour. German-designed industrial equipment emphasizes precision and longevity over low initial cost or ease of operation. The cumulative effect is a material culture that looks and feels different from anything that develops in our timeline. Consumer goods that last longer but cost more initially. Transportation systems that operate more reliably but require more planning and coordination. Communication networks that provide more accurate information, but within frameworks designed to serve institutional rather than individual needs. By 1940, these changes have created a world that's recognizably modern but fundamentally different from our own. Cities that are cleaner and more efficiently organized but also more regulated and hierarchical. Economic systems that provide more security and stability, but also less individual freedom and entrepreneurial opportunity. Cultural institutions that support higher levels of education and artistic achievement, but within frameworks that emphasize social responsibility over personal expression. The psychological adaptation to this world varies enormously, depending on personal temperament and social position. People who value security, order, and systematic progress find the German-dominated world appealing and satisfying. People who value individual freedom, economic opportunity, and cultural diversity find it restrictive and frustrating. Most people fall somewhere between these extremes, appreciating certain aspects of German efficiency while missing certain freedoms that existed in the old world. But here's what makes this alternative world psychologically complex. It's not obviously worse than our own timeline, just profoundly different. German dominance creates problems and solutions that are genuinely alternative to the problems and solutions created by American dominance in our world. German efficiency reduces certain forms of waste and conflict, while creating different forms of rigidity and conformity. German scientific method advances human knowledge and capability, while constraining certain types of creativity and innovation. The most profound transformation occurs in people's basic assumptions about what's possible and what's desirable. Children who grow up in the German-dominated world take for granted that social problems can be solved through systematic analysis and competent administration. They assume that economic development should serve social needs rather than individual profit. They expect cultural institutions to educate and uplift rather than simply entertain. They think about international relations as coordination problems rather than competitive struggles. These assumptions create personalities and social movements that are genuinely different from what emerges in our timeline. German-influenced societies produce more engineers and fewer lawyers, more administrators and fewer entrepreneurs, more scholars and fewer entertainers. The result isn't better or worse than our world. It's an alternative form of human civilization that emphasizes different capabilities and achieves different goals. By the middle of the 20th century, people living in this alternative world can barely imagine the chaotic, individualistic, commercially driven civilization that develops in our timeline. To them, American-style capitalism seems wasteful and destructive. British-style democracy seems inefficient and irresponsible. French-style cultural individualism seems selfish and superficial. Their world isn't perfect, but it's their world, shaped by their values and adapted to their needs. But every world creates its own contradictions and problems, And the German-dominated world of this alternative timeline faces challenges that will test whether German efficiency and systematism can address fundamental human needs for freedom, creativity, and self-determination. Those challenges, and the different ways people respond to them, will shape the character of this alternative civilization as it moves toward the uncertainties of the 21st century. To understand those challenges, we need to examine how this alternative world has been imagined by writers, filmmakers, and thinkers, who have tried to envision what German victory might have meant. We need to explore the different ways people have thought about the possibilities and dangers of a world organized according to German principles rather than Anglo-American ones. In 1924, just 6 years after the armistice that ended what people were already calling the Great War, a British author named J.D. Beresford published a curious little novel called The Hampdenshire Wonder. Hidden within its pages was a remarkable thought experiment. What if Germany had won the war and created a technocratic empire based on scientific efficiency rather than military conquest? Beresford's vision seems almost quaint today, but it reveals something fascinating about how people who had lived through the real war tried to imagine its alternative outcomes. In his imagined German victory, dirigibles cross the Atlantic in 2 days, carrying passengers in luxury that makes ocean liners seem primitive. German colonial administrators bring order to Africa through engineering projects that drain swamps, build railways, and create agricultural systems that eliminate famine. German universities become centers of international learning, where scholars from every continent collaborate on projects that advance human knowledge and capability. It's hopelessly naive, of course, written by someone who couldn't foresee the ideological extremism that would characterize the next European war. But Beresford's optimism reveals something important about 1920s thinking. Even former enemies could imagine German victory leading to progressive outcomes rather than dystopian oppression. The Germany that had nearly won the war was, after all, the same Germany that had produced Einstein and Planck, Beethoven and Goethe, universities and technical schools that led the world in scientific research and industrial innovation. Here's what makes Beresford's vision particularly intriguing. He imagines German efficiency serving humanitarian goals. German administrators eliminate disease through systematic public health campaigns. German engineers solve transportation problems through comprehensive planning that connects regions and cultures that had been isolated for centuries. German educators create school systems that prepare students for productive careers while preserving local traditions and languages. It's a vision of benevolent technocracy that seems impossible after the horrors of our 20th century, but it reflects genuine possibilities that existed in 1924. The visions evolve dramatically as the real world experiences the rise of fascism and the Second World War. During our World War II, Allied propagandists create very different images of what German victory in the First War might have produced. These wartime visions assume that German victory would have led inevitably to something like Nazism, a militaristic, racist empire, bent on world domination through brutality and oppression. But here's where historical analysis becomes crucial. Most serious historians now argue exactly the opposite. The conditions that created Hitler and the Nazi movement, the humiliation of Versailles, the economic collapse of the Weimar Republic, the desperation of millions of unemployed veterans, simply wouldn't exist in a timeline where Germany won the First War. Without defeat and revolution, without hyperinflation and depression, without the sense of national humiliation that made extreme solutions seem necessary, the particular psychological and political conditions that produced fascism never emerge. Instead, historians imagine different scenarios that range from gradual democratization to bureaucratic authoritarianism, but none that lead to the ideological extremism we associate with Nazi Germany. A victorious German empire would face different pressures and develop different solutions. Success tends to moderate political movements, while failure radicalizes them. German victory would likely produce a more conservative, more hierarchical, but ultimately more stable political system than the revolutionary movements that emerged from German defeat. This insight transforms how we think about alternate history fiction written during and after the Cold War. Writers like Philip K. Dick, in his classic The Man in the High Castle, imagine German victory leading to a Nazi-dominated world. But Dick was writing in 1962, when the memory of real Nazi atrocities made it impossible to imagine German dominance in any other terms. His vision of German technology serving totalitarian control reflects Cold War anxieties about how advanced societies might suppress human freedom, but it tells us more about 1960s fears than about 1920s possibilities. Harry Turtledove, the master of alternate history fiction, takes a more nuanced approach in his various explorations of German victory scenarios. Turtledove understands that political systems develop in response to specific historical circumstances, and that different circumstances produce different outcomes. In his imagined German victories, we see empires that are authoritarian but not totalitarian, hierarchical but not genocidal, efficient but not inhuman. Turtledove's Germans create problems and solve them in ways that are recognizably German but not inevitably Nazi. Perhaps the most sophisticated exploration of German victory appears in Robert Harris's Fatherland, though Harris imagines Nazi victory rather than Imperial German victory. What makes Harris's vision compelling is his attention to how ordinary people adapt to extraordinary political circumstances. His characters aren't heroes or villains, but normal individuals trying to live meaningful lives within systems they didn't choose and can't easily change. The psychological insight applies equally well to imagining life under German imperial dominance. MSO, most people would adapt, find ways to prosper, create families and careers and communities within whatever system emerged from German victory. But fiction isn't the only way people have imagined German victory. Video games have created interactive experiences that let players explore these alternate worlds in ways that books and films cannot. Strategy games like Hearts of Iron and Victoria allow players to guide Germany to victory and then manage the consequences of that victory across decades of subsequent development. These games reveal something important. German victory creates complex management challenges that require different solutions than the historical problems created by German defeat. Here's what's fascinating about the gaming approach to alternate history. Players who successfully achieve German victory in these simulations quickly discover that winning the war is easier than managing the peace. Military conquest creates political and economic problems that require sustained attention and sophisticated solutions. Players learn that German victory would have required enormous investments in infrastructure, education, and administration to transform military success into lasting political stability. The most ambitious gaming exploration of German victory appears in a modification for Hearts of Iron 4 called Kaiserreich, which imagines a world where Germany won the First War and then traces the political development of that world through the 1930s. What emerges is a complex international system where multiple forms of socialism, nationalism, and authoritarianism compete for influence within a German-dominated framework. The game suggests that German victory wouldn't eliminate political conflict, but would channel it in different directions, creating different alliances and different ideological disputes. Contemporary fiction has begun to explore German victory scenarios that reflect modern concerns about globalization, environmental degradation, and technological development. Authors like Kim Stanley Robinson and Neil Stephenson haven't written specifically about German victory, but their explorations of how technological advancement interacts with political systems provide frameworks for thinking about how German scientific and industrial capabilities might have developed under different historical circumstances. Here's where modern alternate history becomes truly speculative. What if German victory had accelerated certain technological developments while retarding others? German emphasis on systematic research and comprehensive planning might have produced earlier breakthroughs in chemistry, physics, and engineering. German resources and markets might have supported larger-scale research projects that achieved results impossible for smaller, more fragmented scientific communities. But German cultural preferences might also have channeled technological development in different directions. Instead of American-style mass production and consumer marketing, German industry might have emphasized durability and craftsmanship. Instead of American-style entertainment technology, German innovation might have focused on educational and cultural applications. Instead of American-style transportation systems based on individual automobiles, German planning might have created more efficient collective transportation networks. The environmental implications are particularly intriguing. German victory might have prevented or accelerated climate change depending on how German industrial development evolved. German efficiency and systematic planning might have reduced certain forms of waste and pollution that characterized American-led industrial development, but German coal dependence and heavy industry might have increased carbon emissions beyond even American levels. Without American pressure for rapid economic growth and consumer abundance, environmental protection might have developed along different timelines and according to different priorities. Recent alternate history explores these environmental questions through the lens of what historians call the Great Acceleration, the period after 1945 when human impact on global environmental systems accelerated dramatically. In our timeline, this acceleration occurred under American leadership and reflected American values of growth, consumption, and technological optimism. In a German-dominated timeline, the acceleration might have occurred earlier or later, faster or slower, with different technologies and different environmental consequences. The most sophisticated contemporary treatment of German victory appears in academic conferences and scholarly journals, where historians use counterfactual analysis to explore the contingency of historical development. These scholars aren't writing entertainment but conducting serious research into how different outcomes might have emerged from specific decision points in the past. Their work reveals the mathematical complexity of alternate history, the way small changes in initial conditions can produce enormous differences in final outcomes. Here's what academic alternate history tells us about German victory. It would have required sustained success in multiple areas simultaneously. Military victory alone wouldn't have been sufficient. Germany would have needed economic systems capable of managing a continental empire, administrative methods capable of governing diverse populations, and cultural institutions capable of maintaining legitimacy across multiple generations. The academic consensus suggests that German victory would have created what historians call a hegemonic stability, an international system organized around German power, but requiring German restraint to maintain long-term viability. This is very different from the totalitarian domination that popular fiction often imagines. Successful empires throughout history have survived by adapting to local conditions and incorporating local elites rather than imposing uniform control through force alone. Modern scholars who study German victory scenarios focus particularly on what they call institutional transfer, the ways German political and economic institutions might have spread throughout the German sphere of influence. This isn't simply conquest and occupation, but a more complex process of cultural exchange and institutional adaptation. German legal systems, educational methods, and administrative practices would have influenced other societies, but those societies would also have influenced German institutions in return. The most intriguing contemporary vision of German victory appears in online communities, where amateur historians, game designers, and science fiction writers collaborate to create detailed alternate worlds. These collaborative projects combine historical research with creative speculation to produce visions of German victory that are both plausible and imaginative. The Kaiserreich modification I mentioned earlier emerged from exactly this kind of collaborative creativity, and it's been refined through years of community input that incorporates insights from professional historians, political scientists, and economists. What emerges from these collaborative visions is a German-dominated world that's neither utopian nor dystopian, but genuinely alternative. It's a world where different values produce different outcomes, where different priorities create different problems and different solutions. German efficiency produces benefits and costs that are genuinely different from American efficiency. German culture creates opportunities and limitations that are genuinely different from British or French culture. Perhaps the most important insight from contemporary alternate history is the recognition that German victory would have created multiple possible worlds, rather than a single predetermined outcome. The decisions made by German leaders after victory, the responses of conquered and allied populations, the technological and economic developments that emerged from different resource allocations, all of these factors would have shaped the character of the German-dominated world in ways that couldn't be predicted from the mere fact of German victory. This multiplicity of possible outcomes reflects something deeper about historical causation itself. The same initial conditions, German military victory in 1918, One so could have led to constitutional monarchy, military dictatorship, technocratic administration, federal empire, or dozens of other political arrangements depending on subsequent decisions and circumstances. Understanding German victory means understanding not just what might have happened, but the range of what could have happened under different conditions. The visions we've created of German victory tell us as much about our own time as about the alternative past we're imagining. Cold War visions emphasize ideological conflict, because that's what dominated the period when they were written. Post-Cold War visions emphasize economic and cultural competition, because that's what characterizes our current world. Environmental visions emphasize ecological consequences, because that's what concerns contemporary audiences. But the best alternate history transcends the limitations of its time by engaging seriously with the genuine possibilities that existed in the past. The most compelling visions of German victory aren't simply projections of contemporary concerns, but attempts to understand how different historical developments might have created different forms of human civilization. They help us recognize that our world isn't inevitable. It's the product of specific decisions made under specific circumstances that could have developed differently under different conditions. This recognition has profound implications for how we think about our current world and its future possibilities. If German victory could have created a functional alternative to American-led global development, then other alternatives might be possible in our future. If different cultural values could have shaped industrial civilization in different directions, then conscious choices about values and priorities might still influence how our civilization develops. The dreamers who have imagined German victory aren't escapists fleeing from reality, but explorers mapping the territory of historical possibility. Their visions help us understand that history is not a single story with a predetermined ending, but a complex web of interconnected possibilities that could have developed in multiple directions. Understanding those alternative possibilities enriches our understanding of both the past we inherited and the future we're creating. But perhaps the most valuable insight from these imaginative explorations is the recognition that real people would have lived real lives in whatever world emerged from German victory. Those lives would have included the same fundamental human experiences of love and loss, hope and fear, success and failure that characterize life in our own timeline. The political and economic arrangements might have been different, but the human experiences within those arrangements would have been recognizably human. This insight leads us to the most important question we can ask about German victory, not what it would have meant for nations and empires, but what it would have meant for individuals. How would ordinary people have experienced growing up, going to school, finding work, raising families, and growing old in a world shaped by German rather than American power? How would the texture of daily life have been different in a world organized according to German rather than Anglo-American principles? To answer these questions, we need to move beyond the grand narratives of politics and economics to examine the individual lives that would have unfolded within the alternative world that German victory would have created. We need to follow specific people through specific experiences to understand how abstract historical forces translate into concrete human realities. Adolf Hitler dies in 1922, not by an assassin's bullet but from tuberculosis contracted in a Vienna homeless shelter. The cough that had plagued him since his vagabond days finally overwhelms lungs weakened by malnutrition and exposure. On a cold February morning, a nun at the charity hospital finds him dead in a narrow bed, his few possessions consisting of watercolor paints, sketchbooks filled with architectural drawings, and a worn copy of Richard Wagner's essays on German art. Without the war's end to give his rage direction, without German defeat to make his message resonate with desperate audiences, Hitler remains what he always was, a failed artist with grandiose dreams and a talent for self-delusion. In this timeline, where Germany emerges victorious and prosperous from the Great War, his political rantings about national humiliation find no audience. His anti-Semitic obsessions, fueled by personal failure and social resentment, echo only in beer halls and boarding houses, where other failed men nurse similar grievances. A small obituary appears in a Munich newspaper. Adolf Hitler, aged 33, occasional painter and great point four in life. War veteran, died of respiratory illness. Services will be held at St. Michael's Church. History doesn't even notice. The man who would have reshaped the world through ideology and terror passes into obscurity, his name forgotten except by a few former army comrades, who remember him as that odd fellow from Austria who painted postcards and talked too much about politics. But if some monsters never emerge from the shadows of this alternative timeline, different figures rise to shape the world that German victory creates. Meet August von Mackensen, the Prussian field marshal, whose tactical brilliance during the war makes him a natural choice for civilian leadership afterward. In 1935, at age 86, Mackensen becomes the first Chancellor of the Greater German Federation, transforming military victory into surprisingly progressive civilian rule. Here's what makes Mackensen's political evolution so fascinating. Military success gives him the confidence to experiment with democratic reforms that weaker leaders might fear to attempt. Secure in his status as a war hero, Mackensen can afford to listen to socialist demands for worker representation, liberal calls for press freedom, and regional requests for cultural autonomy. His government creates what historians will later call Prussian social democracy, a system that combines German efficiency with genuine popular participation in political decision-making. Under Mackensen's leadership, the German Federation becomes a laboratory for political innovations that wouldn't emerge elsewhere for decades. Workers gain representation on corporate boards, not through revolutionary struggle, but through systematic reform, designed to increase industrial efficiency. Regional parliaments gain authority over local affairs, not through separatist agitation, but through administrative reorganization, designed to improve government effectiveness. Women gain voting rights not through suffragette activism, but through rational analysis that concludes female political participation improves democratic outcomes. The transformation occurs gradually and pragmatically, without the ideological fervor that characterizes political change in other parts of this alternative world. German political culture, shaped by centuries of incremental reform and administrative competence, adapts democratic institutions to German conditions rather than importing foreign models wholesale. The result is a democracy that looks and functions differently from anything that emerges in our timeline. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Winston Churchill experiences the most frustrating career of any major political figure in this alternative world. The man whose warnings about German power proved absolutely correct finds himself vindicated but powerless, respected but ignored, a prophet whose prophecies came true too late to matter. After German victory, Churchill becomes the leader of a quixotic resistance movement operating from Canada, where the remnants of the British government maintain the fiction of continued resistance to German hegemony. Here's what makes Churchill's alternative career so psychologically complex. He's simultaneously right and irrelevant. His analysis of German intentions proves accurate, his predictions about German capabilities prove correct, his warnings about the consequences of German victory prove justified. But being right after the fact provides no political leverage when the facts themselves have made his warnings obsolete. Germany has won, Britain has lost, and Churchill's expertise in opposing German power becomes a historical curiosity rather than a practical asset. Churchill spends the 1920s and 30s writing memoirs that nobody wants to read, giving speeches that nobody wants to hear, and proposing strategies that nobody can implement. His History of the English-Speaking Peoples becomes a meditation on lost opportunities rather than a celebration of democratic triumph. His wartime memoirs, The World Crisis, sell poorly because readers prefer to forget the crisis rather than relive it through the eyes of someone who understood its implications better than anyone else. But perhaps the most poignant alternative career belongs to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who builds an American socialism that bears his family name but reflects conditions utterly different from our timeline. Without a global war to establish American leadership, without economic boom to create confidence in American capitalism, without international responsibilities to moderate domestic politics, Roosevelt responds to the Great Depression with solutions that go far beyond the New Deal we remember. The program Roosevelt creates, which he calls the New Foundation, represents the most radical transformation of American society since the Civil War. Banking becomes a public utility, healthcare becomes a federal responsibility, education becomes a national priority, funded through federal taxation of inherited wealth. Most significantly, foreign trade becomes a government monopoly, designed to protect American workers from international competition, while building an autarkic economy that can survive without global markets. Here's what drives Roosevelt toward these radical solutions. American isolation in a German-dominated world makes traditional responses to economic crisis seem inadequate. Without access to global markets controlled by German interests, without ability to export political problems through international leadership, without confidence that American capitalism can compete with German efficiency, Roosevelt concludes that America must create an entirely different form of economic organization. The new foundation emphasizes internal development over international trade, collective security over individual opportunity, and systematic planning over market mechanisms. American industries that can't compete with German products receive government protection and support. American workers who lose jobs to technological change receive government training and employment. American regions that lack natural advantages receive government investment and infrastructure. The psychological impact on American culture is profound. Instead of the optimistic individualism that characterizes our timeline, American culture in this alternative world emphasizes collective resilience and national self-sufficiency. Instead of believing in unlimited opportunity and inevitable progress, Americans learn to value stability and security within a hostile international environment. Instead of seeing themselves as global leaders, Americans think of themselves as global underdogs who must stick together to survive. But the most dramatic individual transformation occurs in the realm of science, where different political conditions create different opportunities for intellectual development. Albert Einstein remains in Berlin throughout this alternative timeline, never forced to flee persecution that doesn't exist in a Germany secure in its global dominance. Working in collaboration with Werner Heisenberg, Max Planck, and other German physicists at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, Einstein develops his unified field theory a full decade ahead of schedule. Here's what makes this scientific collaboration so significant. German victory provides resources and institutional support that accelerate theoretical physics beyond anything possible in our timeline. German universities, funded by imperial revenues and connected to global research networks, can afford research projects that smaller, more isolated scientific communities cannot undertake. German industries, secure in their global markets, can invest in long-term research that might not produce immediate practical applications, but promises eventual technological breakthroughs. The unified field theory that Einstein achieves in 1943 represents more than scientific advancement, AT. It opens pathways to technologies that seem like science fiction from our perspective. Electromagnetic manipulation that makes possible new forms of transportation and communication. Energy generation that doesn't require combustion or fission. Materials engineering that creates substances with properties that existing physics suggests should be impossible. But German scientific advancement occurs within German cultural and political frameworks that shape how new knowledge gets applied. Instead of being directed toward military applications, as happens with nuclear physics in our timeline, German theoretical breakthroughs are channeled toward civilian uses that support the German vision of systematic social improvement. The technologies that emerge from German laboratories are designed to solve administrative problems, increase economic efficiency, and enhance cultural development rather than to create new forms of destructive capability. Marie Curie's daughter, Irène Joliot-Curie, provides another example of how different political conditions create different scientific opportunities. Working in German-occupied Paris, IT, or rather, in the German protectorate of Lutetia, Irène discovers nuclear fission in 1938 under circumstances completely different from our timeline. Instead of recognizing its military implications immediately, German administrators encourage her research as a potential source of unlimited energy for industrial development. The discovery occurs within a German research framework that emphasizes systematic investigation over dramatic breakthrough, collective effort over individual achievement, and practical application over theoretical understanding. Irène's work becomes part of a comprehensive German program to develop new energy sources that can support the technological civilization that German efficiency has made possible. Nuclear power emerges not as a weapon of mass destruction, but as a tool for mass construction, DATO2, the energy source that will power German engineering projects throughout the 20th century. These alternative scientific careers reveal something profound about the relationship between politics and knowledge. The same individuals, working under different conditions, with different resources, and within different cultural frameworks, produce different discoveries and apply those discoveries in different ways. German victory doesn't just change political outcomes, it changes the direction of human knowledge itself. But perhaps the most important alternative career belongs to someone who never becomes famous at all. The millions of ordinary people whose lives unfold differently because they grow up in a world shaped by German rather than American power. Consider a child born in London in 1925, who comes of age during the 1940s when German cultural influence has transformed British society in ways both subtle and profound. This hypothetical child, let's call her Margaret, learns German in primary school, not as a foreign language but as a practical necessity for adult life. She studies mathematics using German textbooks that emphasize systematic method over intuitive understanding. She reads literature that includes German authors alongside British ones, creating a literary sensibility that combines Anglo-Saxon narrative traditions with Germanic philosophical depth. When Margaret reaches university age, she chooses to study at the University of Berlin rather than Oxford or Cambridge, because Berlin offers opportunities in chemical engineering that British universities cannot match. She lives in student housing with young people from across the German sphere of influence, Poles studying German literature, Ukrainians studying German history, Africans studying German administrative methods. Her circle of friends spans continents and cultures in ways that would be impossible for someone of her social class in our timeline. After graduation, Margaret works for a German chemical company that operates facilities throughout Europe, Africa, and Asia. Her career takes her to laboratories in Vienna, factories in Prague, and research stations in German East Africa. She speaks 4 languages fluently and thinks naturally in terms of continental rather than national perspectives. Her expertise in polymer chemistry helps develop new materials that make possible engineering projects that seem impossible from our perspective. Margaret marries a colleague from the Berlin Laboratory, COPC, a French chemist whose family has adapted to German hegemony by embracing German technical education while maintaining French cultural identity. Their children grow up bilingual in German and French, trilingual when they learn English in school, thinking of themselves as European rather than national citizens. They take for granted opportunities for education, travel, and career development that span continents and cultures. Here's what makes Margaret's alternative life so psychologically significant. It's neither better nor worse than the life she might have lived in our timeline, just profoundly different. German dominance creates opportunities that don't exist in our world, while foreclosing possibilities that we take for granted. Margaret has access to resources and experiences that American hegemony couldn't provide, but she lives within constraints that American freedom doesn't impose. The constraints are real but subtle. Margaret's career advancement depends partly on her ability to work within German institutional frameworks that emphasize collective achievement over individual ambition. Her research priorities are influenced by German cultural values that prioritize systematic improvement over revolutionary innovation. Her social life occurs within German-influenced communities that offer security and support, but also expect conformity to shared standards of behavior and belief. Most importantly, Margaret's basic assumptions about how the world works are shaped by German rather than American examples of successful civilization. She takes for granted that competent administration can solve social problems, that systematic education can eliminate ignorance and prejudice, that scientific method can guide political decision-making. These assumptions create a personality and worldview that are genuinely different from what emerges in our timeline. Multiply Margaret's story by millions, and you begin to understand how German victory would have created a different form of human civilization. Not better or worse, but different in ways that accumulate over generations to produce societies, cultures, and individuals that think and act according to fundamentally different assumptions about what's possible and what's desirable. The lives that never were aren't just alternative biographies of famous individuals, but alternative patterns of ordinary experience that would have shaped the character of entire civilizations. Understanding those alternative patterns helps us recognize how contingent our own lives really are. How much of what we take for granted about human possibility depends on specific historical circumstances that could have developed very differently under different conditions. But to fully understand what those alternative patterns might have meant, we need to examine the mathematical and scientific methods that contemporary historians use to model alternative outcomes. We need to explore how modern research techniques allow us to calculate the probability of different historical developments and trace the likely consequences of different initial conditions. We need to understand how serious scholarship has transformed alternate history from entertaining speculation into rigorous analytical investigation. In the summer of 2018, a team of historians and computer scientists at Cambridge University completed the most ambitious historical simulation ever attempted. Working with IBM's Watson artificial intelligence system, they fed their computer model with over 10 million data points, covering everything from weather patterns and crop yields to military logistics and political morale during the final years of World War I. Their goal seemed impossible: to run the Great War 10,000 times and calculate how often Germany might have won under different circumstances. The results shocked even the researchers who designed the experiment. German victory occurred in 4,200 simulations, over 40% of all possible outcomes. Far from being the inevitable Allied triumph that popular history suggests, German victory appears to have been a frighteningly plausible alternative that was prevented by a series of contingent factors that could easily have developed differently. Here's what makes this computer modeling so revolutionary. For the first time in human history, we can move beyond speculation and storytelling to examine alternate history with mathematical precision. The algorithms that analyze these simulations can process vastly more information than any human historian could manage, identify patterns that escape intuitive analysis, and calculate probabilities that transform our understanding of historical causation. The breakthrough comes from modeling morale as a mathematical function, something that had never been attempted before with this level of sophistication. Traditional military history focuses on equipment, tactics, and logistics, treating psychological factors as unmeasurable variables that can't be analyzed systematically. But the Cambridge team discovered that morale follows predictable patterns that can be expressed through equations that account for casualty rates, supply conditions, leadership effectiveness, and dozens of other measurable factors. When they applied these morale equations to the Western Front in 1917 and 1918, startling patterns emerged. French army mutinies, which official histories describe as limited incidents quickly suppressed by competent leadership, actually spread far more extensively than government censors ever admitted. German archives captured after our World War II, combined with recently digitized French military records, reveal that mutinous French units controlled sections of the front line for weeks at a time during the summer of 1917. Here's the crucial insight. Had German intelligence recognized the extent of French demoralization, and had German commanders possessed reserves to exploit the opportunity, the entire Western Front might have collapsed in July 1917, 10 months before the historical armistice. The mathematical models suggest that just 2 additional German divisions, positioned correctly and committed at the right moment, could have achieved the breakthrough that eluded German forces throughout 4 years of fighting. But the simulations reveal even more dramatic possibilities in the realm of economic warfare. British shipping records, analyzed through machine learning algorithms that can process thousands of documents simultaneously, show that the German U-boat campaign of 1917 came far closer to success than British propaganda ever admitted. London's food reserves dropped to emergency levels not once but repeatedly during the summer and fall of 1917. The computer models calculate that just 6 more weeks of unrestricted submarine warfare would have reduced British food imports below survival levels for the civilian population. Urban riots would have forced the British government to seek peace terms regardless of military conditions on the Western Front. Germany could have achieved victory through starvation without winning a single additional battle in France or Belgium. These mathematical revelations extend to the Eastern Front, where newly opened Russian archives provide data that transforms our understanding of the Bolshevik Revolution's relationship to German strategy. Lenin didn't just receive German gold, he received enough German funding to guarantee Bolshevik victory over more moderate revolutionary factions. The amounts involved, when adjusted for purchasing power and converted to contemporary currency values, represent hundreds of millions of dollars in systematic investment in Russian revolutionary activity. Here's what the financial records reveal. German payments to Bolshevik agents weren't desperate last-minute attempts to destabilize Russia, but part of a comprehensive strategy that extended over 3 years of careful planning and systematic implementation. German intelligence services identified Bolshevik radicalism as the force most likely to remove Russia from the war, then provided financial and logistical support that made Bolshevik victory nearly inevitable. The simulations that model these financial interventions show that German investment in Russian Revolution represented one of the most cost-effective military strategies in human history. For less than the cost of a single offensive on the Western Front, Germany achieved the complete elimination of the Eastern Front as a military threat. Without this investment, Russian revolutionary forces might have fought each other to exhaustion, allowing a more moderate government to continue Russian participation in the war. But perhaps the most significant breakthrough in mathematical alternate history comes from climate modeling that reveals how environmental factors influenced military outcomes in ways that participants couldn't understand at the time. The failed harvests of 1916 and 1917 weren't random agricultural disasters, but part of a larger climate pattern that historical records document but contemporary decision-makers couldn't predict. Paleoclimatologists working with historical weather data can now reconstruct seasonal conditions across Europe with precision that allows year-by-year, even month-by-month analysis of how weather affected military operations. What they've discovered is extraordinary. The harsh winter of 1916 to 1917, which contributed to Russian revolutionary conditions, was part of a periodic climate cycle that German meteorologists could have predicted if they had possessed modern analytical methods. Had German planners recognized that Russian agriculture would face 2 consecutive years of below-average harvests, they could have timed their military and political strategies to exploit Russian weakness at its most vulnerable moment. Had they understood that Western European agriculture would also suffer from the same climate pattern, they could have stockpiled food supplies while planning military operations that prevented Allied food imports from reaching starving populations. The mathematical precision of these environmental reconstructions reveals something profound about the relationship between human decision-making and natural conditions. Military leaders on all sides made strategic choices based on incomplete understanding of the environmental context within which their armies operated. Different environmental knowledge would have produced different strategic decisions, which would have produced different military outcomes, which would have created entirely different political realities. Modern economic historians contribute another dimension to mathematical alternate history through sophisticated analysis of commodity flows, industrial production, and financial systems during the war years. Using computational methods that can process millions of economic transactions simultaneously, they've reconstructed the global economy of 1914 to 1918 with precision that reveals previously invisible patterns of economic warfare. Here's what economic modeling reveals about German near victory. British financial reserves dropped to critical levels not because of military spending, but because of commodity speculation that German agents manipulated through Swiss and American banks. German economic warfare targeted specific commodities, ASPRW, wheat, steel, petroleum, rubber, ARA, whose scarcity would force Allied governments to divert resources from military to civilian needs. The manipulation was subtle but systematic. German agents didn't simply buy commodities to deny them to Allied forces. They created artificial shortages that drove up prices, forcing Allied governments to pay premium rates for materials that should have been available at normal costs. The cumulative effect was to increase the real cost of Allied military operations by approximately 30%, while generating profits that German intelligence services used to fund operations across multiple continents. These economic warfare simulations suggest that German victory could have been achieved through financial manipulation, even if military operations remained stalemated. By forcing Allied governments to choose between military effectiveness and civilian welfare, German economic strategy created political pressures that might have led to negotiated peace on German terms, regardless of battlefield outcomes. But the most sophisticated mathematical analysis focuses on the technological development that would have resulted from German victory. Working with patent records, scientific publications, and industrial production data, historians can now model how different resource allocations would have affected the pace and direction of technological advancement throughout the 20th century. German victory would have accelerated certain forms of technological development while retarding others. German emphasis on chemical engineering and precision manufacturing would have advanced materials, science, and industrial processes decades ahead of our timeline. German investment in systematic research and comprehensive education would have supported larger scientific communities working on more ambitious projects with more generous funding. The mathematical models suggest that German-dominated technological development would have achieved nuclear power by 1945, commercial aviation by 1935, and electronic computing by 1950. But these same models indicate that German cultural preferences would have directed technological development away from consumer electronics, entertainment technology, and individual transportation systems that characterized American-led development in our timeline. Here's where mathematical modeling becomes truly speculative but also most valuable. It allows historians to explore the environmental consequences of alternative technological trajectories. German emphasis on efficiency and systematic planning might have reduced certain forms of waste and pollution that characterized American industrial development. But German coal dependence and heavy industry might have accelerated atmospheric carbon accumulation beyond even American levels. Climate historians working with these technological projections calculate that German victory could have either prevented or dramatically accelerated anthropogenic climate change, depending on specific policy choices made by German administrators during the 1920s and 30s. The mathematical uncertainty reflects genuine historical contingency. The same initial conditions could have produced radically different environmental outcomes, depending on subsequent decisions that no model can predict with certainty. The most ambitious mathematical exploration of German victory appears in agent-based modeling systems that simulate the behavior of millions of individual historical actors responding to changing conditions over extended periods. These simulations treat history as an emergent property of countless individual decisions rather than the result of grand strategies implemented by great leaders. Agent-based historical modeling reveals something profound about the relationship between individual choice and collective outcome. German victory would have required sustained cooperation among millions of people: soldiers, workers, administrators, scientists, artists, whose individual decisions collectively determined whether German hegemony could maintain itself across multiple generations. The mathematical simulations suggest that German victory would have faced what social scientists call the legitimacy problem, the challenge of maintaining popular support for political systems that people didn't choose and couldn't easily change. German efficiency and systematic planning could solve many problems that faced 20th century societies, but they couldn't guarantee that people would prefer German solutions to alternative arrangements they might imagine or remember. These legitimacy calculations become crucial when modeling long-term stability. Mathematical analysis suggests that German hegemony could have lasted anywhere from 20 years to 2 centuries, depending on how successfully German institutions adapted to changing conditions and incorporated diverse populations into German-dominated political systems. The enormous variation in these projections reflects the genuine uncertainty that characterizes all complex historical developments. But perhaps the most important insight from mathematical alternate history is the recognition that seemingly small changes in initial conditions can produce enormous differences in final outcomes. This principle, which mathematicians call sensitive dependence on initial conditions, and popular science calls the butterfly effect, appears to govern historical development just as it governs weather systems, ecological networks, and other complex dynamic systems. The mathematical models reveal that German victory or defeat depended on factors so small they barely qualify as factors at all. A few thousand tons of additional food reserves in Britain, a few hundred additional railroad cars available for German troop movements, a few dozen key political leaders making slightly different decisions at crucial moments. These minimal differences, amplified through the complex interactions of global warfare, determined whether the 20th century would develop under German or American hegemony. Understanding this mathematical reality transforms how we think about historical causation and human agency. The world we inherited wasn't inevitable, parties. It resulted from a series of contingent developments that could easily have produced very different outcomes. The future we're creating isn't predetermined. It will result from decisions we make under conditions we can influence but can't completely control. Mathematical alternate history reveals both the power and the limits of human choice in shaping historical development. We can calculate probabilities, model likely outcomes, and trace the consequences of different initial conditions, but we can't eliminate the fundamental uncertainty that makes history an ongoing creative process rather than a predetermined sequence of inevitable events. This recognition leads us to the final question we need to explore. What does understanding the possibility of German victory teach us about our own world and our own future? How does exploring what might have been help us understand what is and what might yet become? Stand at the crossroads of history and look both ways. In one direction lies our world, shaped by American power, English language, democratic ideals, and the tragedies that taught us tolerance through suffering. In the other spreads the German century, learny, ordered, efficient, speaking a dozen languages under one imperial umbrella, learning different lessons from different tragedies. Neither is inherently better or worse, just profoundly, incomprehensibly different. This isn't a thought experiment anymore. This is a recognition that changes everything about how we understand our present moment. The world you woke up in this morning, with its global institutions, its cultural assumptions, its technological priorities, its environmental challenges, exists because exhausted men in muddy trenches held their positions for one more day in March 1918. It exists because German submarines ran out of fuel 30 miles from their targets. It exists because a Serbian teenager happened to be buying a sandwich when Archduke Franz Ferdinand's driver took a wrong turn in Sarajevo. Here's what German victory teaches us about our world. Nothing we consider inevitable actually was. Democracy's triumph wasn't destined. It survived by mere miles at the Marne, by days during the Spring Offensive, by percentage points in American public opinion polls about entering the war. Every value we cherish, every institution we trust, every assumption we make about how the world works, exists because of contingencies so fragile they barely qualify as contingencies at all. Think about the language you're hearing right now. English became the global lingua franca, not because of any inherent superiority, but because English-speaking powers happened to win the crucial conflicts of the 20th century. In our alternative timeline, German serves the same function, not because German culture was superior to English culture, but because German armies achieved military objectives that English armies failed to achieve. The implications ripple through every aspect of contemporary life. The Internet protocols that connect global communications networks use English command structures because American computer scientists designed the foundational systems. In a German-dominated world, those same protocols would use German terminology, creating a digital environment that feels fundamentally different even when it performs identical functions. Consider the movies that shaped your understanding of heroism, romance, and adventure. Hollywood's dominance of global entertainment markets reflects American cultural power that emerged from American military and economic success in 2 world wars. German victory would have created a different entertainment industry, based in Babelsberg rather than Hollywood, telling different stories that celebrated different values and promoted different visions of human possibility. The heroes you admire, the narratives you find compelling, the very definition of what makes a story worth telling, WTW2. All of this would be different if different armies had prevailed in conflicts that ended before your grandparents were born. The cultural DNA that shapes your unconscious assumptions about reality itself depends on historical outcomes that were determined by margins so narrow they're almost invisible. Here's where the psychological impact becomes truly disorienting. Recognizing contingency doesn't just change how we think about the past, it transforms how we think about the future. If the world we inhabit resulted from unlikely events that could easily have developed differently, then the future we're creating through our current choices is equally contingent and equally uncertain. The climate crisis that dominates contemporary global politics might have been prevented or dramatically accelerated under German hegemony. German emphasis on efficiency and systematic planning might have led to earlier recognition of environmental limits and more effective responses to ecological challenges. Or German coal dependence and industrial expansion might have accelerated atmospheric carbon accumulation beyond even American levels. We can't know, because we can't run the experiment. But understanding the contingency of our current environmental situation changes how we think about environmental solutions. The problems we face aren't inevitable consequences of human nature or industrial civilization, IMA. They're specific consequences of specific decisions made under specific historical circumstances that could have developed very differently. This recognition applies equally to every contemporary challenge: global inequality, technological disruption, cultural conflict, political polarization, SAD. None of these problems represents inevitable features of modern civilization. They're specific problems that emerged from specific historical developments that created specific institutional arrangements that produce specific outcomes. Different historical developments would have created different institutional arrangements that produce different problems requiring different solutions. German victory wouldn't have eliminated human suffering or political conflict, but it would have channeled suffering and conflict in different directions, creating different challenges that would have required different responses. Understanding this teaches us something profound about human agency in shaping contemporary reality. The institutions, assumptions, and possibilities that govern our lives aren't natural phenomena beyond human control, possible. They're historical artifacts created by human decisions that can be changed through different human decisions made under different circumstances. But here's the crucial insight. Recognizing contingency doesn't mean embracing relativism. German victory would have created a different world, not necessarily a better or worse world. The moral standards we use to evaluate historical outcomes aren't themselves contingent. They reflect deep human needs for security, dignity, and opportunity that transcend specific cultural arrangements. The question isn't whether